And without further ado, I have the great honor of introducing two people who I have had the great fortune to work with several times now, particularly on their latest book that I just mentioned. Jennifer Bay-Williams is a professor of mathematics education at the University of Louisville, where she teaches pre-service teachers, emerging elementary math specialists, and doctoral students in mathematics education. And she has authored numerous books as well as many journal articles, many of which focus on procedural fluency, as well as other aspects of effective mathematics teaching and learning. And I'm sure most of you have heard her name before. She is a frequent speaker and presenter at national and state conferences and works with schools and districts around the world. John SanGiovanni is a mathematics supervisor in Howard County, Maryland, and that's where he leads mathematics curriculum development, digital learning, assessment, and professional development for hundreds of teachers that he works with. John is also an adjunct professor and coordinator of the Elementary Math Instructional Leadership Graduate Program at McDaniel College. And like Jenny, he is a multi-time author and national mathematics curriculum and professional learning consultant, and a frequent speaker at national conferences and institutes as well. And I know they have a great presentation in store for you today to talk about what fluency really is and what it's not. So I'll let you two take it away.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Erin, and welcome to everyone. I want to say hello from Maryland and say thank you for spending some time with us this evening. We know that you are busy with all kinds of responsibilities and craziness as we transition back to face-to-face schooling, and just want to say thank you for investing in yourself and investing in the students that you support.
Were you pausing for me to introduce myself? Hi, everyone. John and I are going to be going back and forth throughout the session, and I'm here in Louisville, and so thrilled to have so many people joining us tonight.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about tonight, Jenny.
We are focusing on fluency. Surprise. Our big focus is about what fluency is and what it's not. And we think that the first thing we have to do is take on some widely held misconceptions. So we have a dozen that we're going to get through in 45 minutes. So it's going to be a pretty fast-paced session. And then we want to come back to why these misconceptions matter. And as you can see from the third bullet, it's about equity. So we're going to start with what fluency is. You're seeing various words pop up on the screen that have to do with fluency. You probably hear these words, use these words, and they get used in different contexts along the way. And they all mean slightly different things from each other. And we're not doing a dictionary lesson tonight, but what has happened in the field is we might be talking about mastery when in fact we're really talking about fluency. And in the muddled language, we get mixed messaging happening, and that's making it very complicated for us to actually achieve our goal of fluency.
So what do these terms mean to you? How are they different from each other? And well, are any of these terms synonyms? What do you think?
Yes, feel free to enter ideas in the chat.
So what do you think, Jenny? how do these terms, like, what do they mean? How are they different from each other? And do you see them as synonyms?
There are synonyms up here, and we will be getting to some of these that are not synonymous. But for example, mastery and automaticity to me go hand in hand. Procedural fluency goes with fluency, but fluency without the word procedural in front of it can mean lots of things. So it could be basic fact fluency. We'll get to that later, John.
Got it. And I see some more things popping in the chat box. Without a doubt, feel free to make some other connections. As we go through the night, we're going to take a deeper look into any of or all of these words. But the next thing we want you to think about just for a brief moment is, well, fallacies. And the question is, like, what is a fallacy? Well, fluency fallacy is something misunderstood about fluency. And what we'd like to do tonight is just first spark your interest. What are 3 fluency fallacies you think are most prevalent? And you don't have to put them in the chat box, though you're welcome to if you like. We're going to pause for 30 seconds or so and let you write down, like, what are the 3 things you think are most, well, misunderstood? What are fallacies about fluency? And you are all doing a fantastic job destroying that chat box. I can't even pretend to read all of them as they come in, right? But we suspect there's quite a bit of, well, fallacies that are widely held about fluency. So I'll give you a few moments just to pop some others in there. We were thinking about playing Family Feud with you to see if you could name the top 3 or so, but we decided against that. Oh, I see that. You have to be fluent before you move on to the next thing. The fluency becomes a gatekeeper, right? Well said. So as you put other ideas in the chat box, and you think about some other fluency fallacies in general, let me just talk a little bit about fallacies themselves. And Jenny and I in our work are really familiar with, all sorts of fallacies that are out there about fluency, and it really motivated us to, well, to write a book about it, right? To think about how fluencies exist around the language we use relative to fluency and the ideas that we communicate about fluency, that there are fallacies around the notion of algorithms, as, well, we all know, right? There are fallacies that create inequities and obstructions or barriers to access. And there are fallacies about teaching and assessment. And tonight, what we wanted to do was spotlight some of those fallacies, which are at the core of our work here. And then also spotlight some of the ideas and resources that you'll find not just in the book, but in our other writings as well. So on that note, Jenny, why don't you take us away?
All right, so we are going to start our journey through our 12 fallacies, and I would like to introduce you to the first one, and that is, this is the fallacy side. Fluency is about basic facts. If you just type fluency into Google, you'll see lots of basic facts work, and you see that in like workbooks at the bookstore and so forth and so on. But in fact, it's not just about that. So I noticed several people, when we had all those words up earlier, were asking this question. We think of the fluency in general as this nesting of types of fluency. So it begins with basic fact fluency. That's why it's so important that we actually do work on strategies with basic facts, because those strategies grow. We end up working with strategies for computational fluency, and then procedures grow out from that. So a procedure is, it takes a little bit beyond a computation to, for example, proportions, solving missing value proportions, comparing fractions, things that aren't exactly the 4 operations. And so these strategies grow. We nourish them and they grow. So for example, making 10 a basic fact strategy becomes making tens with whole numbers, making a whole with fractions and decimals. And a strategy, like I call it pretend to 10, when you're thinking of 9 plus 6, and you're thinking, well, I'm just going to pretend that 9's a 10, 10 plus 6, and then you fix it after you've added it. That's compensation, and you can see how useful that is if you look at the column on the right with whole numbers, very useful, and no matter what the size of the whole numbers are, and that also generalizes to decimals and fractions, even though there's not a fraction example there. And so what happens with Fluency is you've got all of this stuff going on. You've got the ability to do conversions, be able to think about, is that equivalent to this other thing? What are the basic facts? How am I using them? What are the operations? All this sort of thing. So it's this busy collection of things. So Fluency includes basic facts and so much more. Number 2 fallacy: mastery, fluency, and automaticity are the same thing. Not true. So for this, we're going to pause again for about 30 seconds. Pick a list that you like and solve whichever ones look interesting to you, because you won't have time to solve them all, but solve in some efficient way. So as you're thinking about how you solve these, many of them don't require a standard algorithm, even though you already know a standard algorithm. Procedural fluency has 3 components. This is well defined. This is not just John and Jenny say so. This is defined by the National Research Council and has been used for years and years. That really, when you're fluent, you pick a method that makes sense. If the first method that you picked didn't work out very well for you, you switched methods, and that's your flexibility. And then hopefully you arrived at an accurate answer. So we have this illustration with 3 components and basically 6 more specific actions that we would be looking for in students when we're really working on procedural fluency. So to be clear, when we see a standard that says fluently subtract versus a standard that says fluently use a standard algorithm, we really should be interpreting them differently. Fluently subtract does not mean fluently use the standard algorithm. Fluently subtract means knowing when you need to use the standard algorithm and when you could actually use a compensation strategy or some other kind of method to get to your answer, depending on the numbers in the problem. So mastery and automaticity might be kind of the same, but fluency really is a much bigger deal. There's a lot more involved in developing fluent students than students who have mastered a topic or an algorithm. All right, John, you're up. What is fluency number 3?
So another fallacy about fluency is that representations are strategies. And these are things I see a lot when folks are doing number talks and other things are happening in classrooms. Think about the problem 29 plus 13 for just a moment. And as each of these students pop up, think about not all of them are strategies necessarily. Tara talks about a strategy, but Oscar uses a representation. Andre uses a representation. Now, she might apply a strategy to that representation, right? And we see that Devante and Kendra, they use strategies as well. But Tina, well, she's using a representation. And there's a belief that, both of these things are the same. In fact, when we compare fractions, like the ones you see on the screen right there, well, representations and strategies become, well, even more evident. And it might be helpful to have these types of things, well, being aware of them in our classrooms, but also then making use of them with our students. The representations help us understand a strategy. But as you can see on the left, Cuisenaire rods, fraction towers, and drawings, again, those are representations and tools. But finding common denominators, or maybe a common numerator, is an example of a strategy for comparing fractions. And sometimes we, well, maybe mix these up a little bit. So there's a fallacy that representations are strategies. But in truth, representations support thinking through strategies, but they are not themselves actually a strategy. And as we dig deeper into fallacies, we start to uncover other types of ideas. Fallacies about standard algorithms, for example, and well, we're sure you're familiar with many of these. The notion that strategies and algorithms are the same thing, well, that's not quite accurate. If you think about strategies, they're number-based, right? You manipulate the numbers, you break them apart, you do all sorts of things with them, right? Well, that happens with strategies. Strategies are left-handed. They work from left to right by place value, kind of like when you're making change, if you think about it. And strategies have all of these flexible options, right? Depending on the experience I've had, my comfort with strategies, and well, the numbers in the problem, I can choose between different options. Whereas algorithms are, well, digit-based. They work in the opposite direction, right? They work from right to left by place value. And they have an established set of steps. So the idea that strategies and algorithms are the same thing isn't exactly accurate. The notion that strategies generally employ flexible student reasoning and algorithms employ enacting a set of steps is the truth that we have to come to grips with and understand that both have value. This is one of my favorites, honestly. There's a notion that the standard algorithm is the best choice always. And more importantly, it's like the penultimate standard, right? We do all these strategies, but the real goal is to learn the algorithm. So let's take a swipe at that for a moment. Take a moment to, well, pick one of those and solve them. So on the left, maybe you thought about turning that into an improper fraction, though we don't call it that anymore, and then multiplying by 4 like I was taught to do. Or maybe you thought of 15 times 4 and then 1/5 times 4. Maybe you made the problem in the middle, 200 plus 388. Or maybe you lined it up. And on the right side, maybe you applied the distributive property and then did both things to both sides of an equation. Or maybe you thought 3 times 8 is 24. And so you thought, what minus 2 is 8? My point is that an algorithm could work if a strategy is unavailable. And so in our book, we write about, well, different activities such as number routines or fluency routines that build or go after, I should say, these fluency fallacies, right? Help us in the classroom, well, teach these ideas. In fact, this is one on the screen right now. Now, this routine is called That One, in which we give students a collection of expressions in different grade levels, of course. And students think about which one would be best solved by an algorithm and which one might be solved better by another strategy. And what's important here is that it's not grade specific, right? That this idea of when an algorithm is a good choice and when it's not, well, it depends on the numbers and experience and things of that nature. So to close out that fallacy, once learned the standard algorithm is best choice? Well, no, because in everyday life, sometimes the algorithm is the best choice, but we're not trying to replace them. Another favorite. Standard algorithms are, well, standard, right? They're the same everywhere. Yeah, that's not exactly it either.
Yeah, and John, just in the chat, one of our international folks was just asking this very question about what their standard algorithms in the U.S. So
that's perfect. It was a perfect plan.
Yes, thank you, Annika.
And I missed that, Annika, because I had 33 things on my screen at the same time. But that is a good catch, Jenny. Thanks for bringing that up. So standard algorithms are standard everywhere, and well, not the case. Not the case, right? So if we take a look at, well, dividing fractions per se, on the left side, we see an approach used in the United States. And on the right side, we see an approach used in Mexico. That's not to say that any one algorithm is used throughout the entire country or throughout the region or something of that nature. It's just to lift up the notion that, well, there are different approaches in different parts of the world to how we do math, right? But the truth is, there are different approaches to how we do math in our own own country, our own school districts. For example, if I was adding 635 and 378, as you see on the screen, there are different ways to go about this as well. There's a algorithm that I was taught on the left side where we do the grouping above that first addend. There's also an algorithm where we do the regrouping below the second addend, which can be easier for students to keep track of. And on the right side, well, there's a version where we're using partial sums in that case. So what's the point? The point is, in a nutshell, standard algorithms are standard everywhere. Well, it's a fallacy. And so that was my turn for a bit. Jenny, you want to take us through our next one, which is some students are just better off knowing one way.
I want to connect to a Sarah, not that just passed through the chat saying, you know, whose tradition is it anyways? So when we say traditional algorithm, you know, really whose tradition? Because this particular fallacy does create problems for us when we think there's just one way to do things. So this is heading into our access. This is a big part of our access into learning mathematics. So this is what happens when we say, oh, hey, these kids are better off if we just teach them one way. If we don't teach these other ways, if we teach these other ways, we're just going to overwhelm them. This is what happens. They get a set of problems. John, I'm ready for the next slide now. Sorry, I wasn't ready before. Solve the missing value problems. I'm going to give you a minute to look at these. Not a minute, really, about 15 seconds. Think how you would solve each.
And Jenny, while people think, I did see a note about, but parents want one way, and we recognize that. And so we did write a chapter about how do we communicate these ideas with parents, and how do we help them, families, understand what fluency is and how we might help them. Sorry, Jenny, now I'm reading the chat box and I'm gonna play.
Yeah. Right, yeah, I love the chat. There's so many great ideas going on in the chat, it's fantastic. Right, so if you look through this list of 5, probably 3, maybe 4 of these, you would probably pick a different way than doing the cross-product method. Well, if you're only teaching students the cross-product method, then they are really just happen to gut it out through this, not even think, just remember, you know, that they're using the steps appropriately instead of really thinking through these problems and really understanding ratio reasoning. So for example, the first one, there's a within ratio relationship there from 15 to 30. And well, that's a 1/2, you know, the denominator is twice the numerator. And so that relationship can help you figure out number 1, and so forth and so on. With number 3, there isn't, you could do a within ratio. With number 2, you could do it a cross ratio. And I see somebody chatted a double or half again. So lots of strategies. Then you might come to number 5 and, well, I don't really see anything there. Okay, I'll pull out my algorithm. So if we only teach an algorithm, kiddos are just at a disadvantage. They're doing strategies they shouldn't be doing, which is slowing them down, and they're making more errors. So it's at their disadvantage. Not to mention, it just disrespects the fact that they can think. So we have these 2 fallacies around equity, even though really all 12 of our fallacies are focusing on equity. And so we really believe that effective instruction on real fluency values the actions such as selecting, understanding, evaluating strategies, the flexibility, the reasonableness. In that way, students develop this strategic competence and adaptive reasoning. That's math. These competencies then positively shape their identity and then nurtures their sense of agency. Yeah, I can figure that out. Yeah, I got this. I can do that one. No, I don't want to use that method. I want to use this method. That's the kind of student that we need to have in our math class. Every student needs to feel that way. So, number 7, each and every student is better off knowing a set of useful strategies, not silly, obscure strategies, but useful strategies.
Right, and you know, I saw in the chat box, Jenny, that Delise talked about we need to teach thinking and reasoning, which warms my heart because that is the essence of mathematics and, well, fluency, as well as problem solving and so much more, right?
So this takes us to, yeah, I was just going to transition. This takes us to, if these are the equity issues, then we have to take them on through our teaching and assessing. So, so John.
Yes, I was going to do that, right? We have to talk about practice a little bit, and then we'll get into some other teaching and assessing fluency fallacies as well. A fallacy that procedural fluency practice is a low-level cognitive experience. Listen, we recognize and know and believe that 40 problems on a piece of paper is a bad idea, right? That diminishes thinking and flexibility. But the truth is that we can have high level cognitive demand and engagement when we're learning about procedures and becoming fluent. And if you take a look on the right side, right, this notion of practice where we judge the usefulness of a method, when we provide practice opportunities for students to compare how they did it to somebody else or how they might invent methods or generalize methods, right? Talking about what an algorithm works, fantastic, of course, right? But like on the right side, as you notice, and we write more about this, of course, around quality practice, this notion of when we can have not just high level engagement, but high level cognitive demand. We know that this is not fluency, right? This is mastering an algorithm maybe, and even then it's probably a bad idea. I know this is how we fall out of love with math when we're 10 though, I know that. So what we write about and what we want you to think about as you leave us tonight is like, what is quality practice? And we write about these 4 pieces of quality practice: that it's focused, that it's varied, connected, and processed. And what that means is that like we're focusing on one thing at a time, that, well, I'll talk about varied in just a moment, but we make connections in that practice and we reflect on what just happened. So in the anchor book that we write about, and there's companion books coming soon that goes with them, right? We provide different levels of practice, from fluency routines to games, to worked examples and, well, learning centers. In fact, worked examples are on the screen right now. We provide different types of worked examples for students to engage with, to others thinking, to critique that, right? And so there's different ways to go about worked examples, and we write about all of those because the point is, good practice takes on many different forms. Speaking of which, this is a routine called share, share, and compare. And Jenny, I know this is one of your favorites. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
This is absolutely one of my favorite routines, and it can be as simple as 4 tasks that students write on a card, or it could be a longer list, but you select problems in which you know there's more than one way to solve them. So then the student solves their own, so they get their own think time, they solve their own method, and now they're ready to get up and use their best social distancing skills and move somewhere in the room, this doesn't really work. I haven't figured out how to do this online, where they find out how somebody thought about number 1, and then they share. So that's the share. Then the partner shares how they solved it. And then they compare higher level thinking, and they can weigh in again on which way is efficient, which way do they like. If they did it the same way, they have to think of a second way. Once they've done that, they thank their partner and off they go to find another partner to share, compare another problem with.
Thanks. I kind of made you off and go before you were ready for it, huh?
So I got the hint. So
you got the hint. Go ahead.
So procedural fluency requires actions like generalizing, inventing, and judging in order to use methods strategically. It is high-level thinking, and so we need this meaningful practice in which those opportunities are there for students. All right, fallacy number 9. Whew. This one is one that I used to say: first learn concepts and then we'll work on procedures. That is actually not entirely true. It is true that we do conceptual foundations, but as they start working on procedures, there's this interaction that each one supports each other. So when you're working on procedures, it improves conceptual understanding, and conceptual understanding improves procedural knowledge. That's in the research. And the more we help kids with their concepts, like place value concepts, the more strategic they can be with what strategy they want to use. So we have to make sure that those connections are happening daily, and not that we're spending 3 or 4 days building the concepts and then 3 or 4 days just gutting out the strategies.
Yeah, and Jenny, I just want to jump in real quickly, because this goes with that idea of like concrete, pictorial, abstract, and that mathematics isn't linear all the time, right? And that when we learn some things and then through iterative practice and what have you, we strengthen connections and expand our understanding. So I really really love that you talked deeply about that one.
Yeah. And before
So tell us what's going on here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about this one. So this is just an example of how where this interplay between a strategy and a visual. And so this is a visual of 10 stacks, but you can see that the top row is colored a different color. So to help students see that if they have 9 of something, it's like 10 of something minus a group, so that they can reason through it. And in this, in the scene, the screen before this one and this one, thank you, John, you read my mind. I see in the chat somebody asking about context. Context is throughout, right? If you think about like mathematical practice number 2 in the United States about reasoning abstractly, part of it is adding context back in as you reason. So the context helps build the conceptual foundation. And then when you have an abstract scenario, then we hope learners start thinking about, will that work? And then they rely on thinking of a concrete example to help them rationalize whether the answer will be the same if they use a different method. So yeah, we haven't taken on context very much here, but it is definitely fluid in and out all the time to help make sense of the abstract concepts.
And Jenny, before I talk about this game, a winning streak, though, I wanted to think about, like, we were just talking about context 2 nights ago, you and I, and this notion of, how context helps us determine reasonableness and make sense of naked computations when we need to, and so forth, right? So as Jenny was talking, I remember this game was coming up, and so winning streak is an opportunity, right, for students to practice something specifically after they've learned the concept of making 10 and some more, or using a 10 or what have you, right? So in this game, if you look in the upper left-hand corner where it says add to 19, students roll a digit or pull a digit card or whatever generator you might use. They add it to 19 and then they cover the space on the game board. Now, what's about this game is that now you see right beside it add to 29. And then right beside it, there's a game called Add to 39. And one of the things that we talk about here, or we talk about in the book, is this notion that students need opportunities to play Add to 19, Add to 29, and Add to 39. So they say things like, Mr. S, it's the same thing. You're just making another 10, and then you have some left over. I'm like, I know. I wonder if that always works. And then I can expand to plus 649 or something like that, if it makes sense to you. In fact, if you see Add to 29 at the top center, and bottom center there's add to 2 9/10. I might play add to 29 right before I play add to 2 9/10 with my 4th or 5th graders, so that they can see how adding 29 and then adding to 2 9/10 has some really similar features, right? So this is just one example, along with the routine, share, compare, and other things of the resources we've baked in to really unpack not just the fallacies, but the learning that we need to take on.
So that brings us to the fact that students need to understand the procedures. They use beginning concepts and then connecting procedures iteratively back and forth. So it's so they have that opportunity to revisit concepts and then connect them. Connecting being the key word. All right, number 10, there's a set list of strategies for any given topic. Wouldn't that be nice and easy? Well, John and I have sort of identified what we think are some pretty significant ones. So not these like tiny ones that might not be worth a person's time, but these ones that generalize from number types, from basic facts to multi-digit to fractions and decimals. This is our list. So remember when John talked about strategies and representations being a bit different, these are the ways that kiddos think. And you can see our short list here. And one of the reasons to keep representation separate is because otherwise it looks like there's a whole bunch of strategies, and there really aren't. If you look for a multiplication here, there's only maybe four generalizable strategies for multiplication. So it's a pretty short list for a particular operation. So should you teach a strategy? This is a conversation John and I have been having as we work on these companion books, because right now we're talking about compensation. Does that make sense for fractions? We got to think about it. So the questions you ask yourself is, does the strategy make sense? Is it useful? Is it efficient? Can I generalize it? Is it transferable to other numbers? And so compensation is a yes, 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 all the way through, except maybe for multiplying fractions, we're not sure. you have an idea, pop it in the chat.
Yeah,
Okay,
you can write
slide.
that chapter. You can write that chapter, as a matter of fact. Go
Okay.
ahead, Jenny.
So there are certain strategies that are must know, while others are less useful and maybe optional. And that, we are professionals. We have to size up our situation and make the best call. Certainly this year, there's nothing more true than us having to make pretty good decisions about what's worth instructional time and what's not. All right, this is a big one for me. Skills test, the skill tests are assessing fluency. Again, something to pop in the chat, or if you haven't seen our blog that we put out, Practice is Not a Worksheet, we have a screenshot for you. So let's just take a look at this. This is the fluency screen you saw earlier. What do you think is the red part of this circle graph and the yellow part of this circle graph? If this circle graph was telling what percentage of a test was assessing fluency, what do you think the red stands for? What do you think the yellow stands for? You look across.
Chrissy didn't even spend much time there. She's like, red, accuracy, right? Yeah, Chrissy. So if we applied some colors to these, right, you might see something like this.
Yeah, in fact, the whole circle is accuracy. That if you were to add in efficiency and flexibility, they're just not there. You can go to the next slide. Right here, it's just about your score. It's just about what you got right. Maybe you get partial credit, that's still accuracy. That's, did you follow the right steps, right? What are we doing to assess efficiency and flexibility, to give it respect? What could we be doing to assess efficiency and flexibility? Well, here's one thing. We're just going to put a few things out here. We have a whole chapter on assessment. But what if we used something like this and even just stapled it to a test that we were giving? Or if we use this as part of our observation when we interacted with them as they're doing fluency work through one of their meaningful practice activities, that just lists all of them. This communicates to the students that this is fluency. This is what I want to see you doing in my classroom to show that you're fluent in whatever topic you're working on.
Right, and I was thinking, Jenny, we've talked about, or we wrote about this notion that we can design or select games and centers or other things to just looking to see if a student is selecting the appropriate strategy. So this rubric or this checklist that you see, right, could be applied to everything, but we might narrow in on one of these things to monitor and see where students are relative to these different actions.
And I think, rubrics were designed ages ago as a way to communicate what expectations are, what you're looking for. This is a great tool for students and for parents to know what really fluency, to have that common language. Back to our first two fluency fallacies. This is what fluency looks like. And if you think about the 3 and the 4 on this rubric, you can see that there's certain words in there, certain things that they're able to do. So they're selecting an efficient strategy. If they're back in the earlier stages of this rubric, they're having trouble. They might only know one method. So it's just pointing out that they're becoming flexible. So a rubric like this, or one that you create with your colleagues, can help establish a good shared definition of fluency.
Sorry about that, Jenny.
No.
Go ahead.
Look, I get the hint.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Okay, there's other things we could do if we had more time with you to brainstorm here. So if you have a good idea, add it to the chat. That's what that little blue thing is at the bottom. But we could give students some instructions that would encourage fluency. So, there's a lot of worksheets out there that say, solve this using, this method. Use the standard algorithm to solve this. Let's take those instructions off and let's say use efficient strategies, use 3 different strategies on this page, circle the ones where you think, you need the standard algorithm. There's just things you can do to have a focus on fluency, real fluency on a traditional assessment.
Yeah, Jenny, and I want to just double down on that real quickly. I love the notion of taking, and we offer up some ideas on how you can do this, right? A selection of problems like this and saying to students, which 2 would you solve by making a whole? Or which 2 would you solve by compensating? Or you get the idea, right? And having them kind of filter through to see, do they choose the problems that are most appropriate for that strategy and what have you. So I just needed to add that on.
Yeah,
as well.
and Gustavo in the chat made a nice comment about it's a nice debrief. That brings me back to share, compare. We can have a conversation about how we solve these problems. Did you use
Sure.
that one? No, I saw a different way that was, oh, I like that. Oh yeah, I should be looking for that. You know, so that's wonderful. All right, our finale, conceptual understand. Okay, sorry. The truth about assessment is that we really need to focus more broadly on all of fluency. If we don't assess it, it's not going to be valued. So we have to figure out how we're going to bring attention to the other components of fluency. All right, our finale, it's going to sound like one you already heard. Hopefully you've already heard this message. Conceptual understanding is more important than learning skills. It isn't more important. So here's my history lesson. I think I'm a little older than John. I might be a lot older than John.
I would go with a little older, but we don't have to do any math to figure that out.
Here we go. It started back in the 70s with the, skill and drill. That's when I was in elementary school, just a true confessions. And then from that back to the basics, the 80s came out. Hey, we should be doing problem solving of the week. And then along come the 90s and we're like, not problem of the week. No, we need to be infusing problem solving every single day, all the time. We got to get kids thinking more. The 2000s were like, yeah, we really need to be focusing on conceptual understanding. Our kids don't understand what they're doing. They have the skills down, but not the procedures. The Common Core comes out and the word strategy is everywhere. People are like, what strategies? What are we supposed to do with all that? Whew. Now it is the year 2021. And the reality is we spent about 30 years trying to get away from just a skill-driven approach by saying we got to focus on conceptual understanding. But what we were not saying, and by we, I mean all of us, was that procedures don't matter, that procedures aren't important. But that's been the messaging. I know I was guilty of it. So what we really want to do is make sure that our messaging is about the pairing, the bonding, the interplay, which was, again, one of our earlier fluencies. But that's why we wanted to conclude with this point, that we cannot disrespect fluency as less important than conceptual understanding. Well-balanced instruction is a balance. Conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and application of math. That's not John and my words. Those are straight out of really the National Science Foundation adding it up, the blending of those three. All right, that takes us back to why, John, would we write a book about figuring out fluency?
Yeah, why do we need to think? Well, I think the brief history lesson right there alone says that we haven't figured it out yet, right? But we have some good ideas about it. Here's the number one reason. To Jenny and to me, fluency is an equity issue. It's an opportunity issue, it's an access issue, and it's so much more. Fluency efforts, yours, mine, Jenny's, our colleagues, we must ensure that every student has access to a range of strategies. They have regular opportunities to choose among those strategies, right? So that, well, they can realize their fluency and apply their fluency to the problems that they face, to the choices that they make. Fluency is an equity issue. And when I'm fluent, I have a greater belief in myself and confidence in myself. I see that I have agency. When I have the opportunity to choose between strategies, I have agency. These 12 fluency fallacies stand in the way of developing confident, competent mathematics learners and doers. And we can do something about this. Now, as we start to wrap up this evening, in a really short time, I want to think about equity again as that identity and agency issue. And Ginny and I write about it in these ways, but think about those fallacies a bit more. At the very beginning, you fired some things in the chat box, the facts I couldn't keep up. Maybe some of you wrote them down on the side, but of these that we dipped our toes into tonight, which ones are in your three most commonly occurring? Which ones did you identify before we started? And just give you a moment to think. Go ahead.
Yeah, take some. Yeah, I was just going to say take some think time, but then you could put your top three numbers in the chat, and then we'll do some entering, and we'll just go flying by. So you can hold.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah, you can hold off submitting, but get your three ideas in chat.
Now, had we played Family Feud, we'll talk about the scores might be another time. There goes the chat box like I expected. And as you put those in, before we go to the next question about these fallacies, right? We want you to know that, again, we write about this notion that we need to help families and communities understand about these fallacies. It's not just on the shoulders of our teachers, our principals, and our school community, right? We need to recognize that all stakeholders have to understand these to some extent. And that holding a fallacy isn't blame, right? It's nobody's fault that this is something that you might believe. We just need to counter with truth and fact, and then the tools to counteract it. So, this might be a question that you take away from the session more so than answer in the moment in the chat box, because they go flying through, but I'll give you a moment to think. Jenny and I organize these around language and notions of algorithms and access and equity and what have you, right? But like, if you were to prioritize, where would you take on? Like, what priorities, which ones are the most important ones for you to take on in your classroom, your school community, the district, whatever role you might have? I'll give you just a moment to think about that. Hopefully it's something you take with you after this evening. And we also recognize that there might be some other fallacies out there. And we talked a lot about this in the process. And most every fallacy we came up with came back to one of these 12, right? We read about these in chapter 2 and unpack the teaching and learning and all the other things that we need to do around that. And before we wrap up this evening, we wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions you had. We agreed before the meeting that if they were hard, you would ask Jenny, and if it was something that was low-hanging fruit, you could just fire that to me, okay? So the question I have for you is, what questions do you have for Jenny?
You know, one of the questions that came in is talking about multiple methods. And they mentioned that they love teaching using multiple methods, but it's hard to review questions or show how to solve problems using every method every time. So how do you maintain multiple methods without going over each method every time you need to show the class why they got a question wrong?
Jenny, you want to start with that?
So could you say the very tail end of that question again?
Sure.
I was taking a note myself, sorry.
How do you maintain using multiple methods for problem solving without going over each method every time when you need to show the class why they got the question wrong?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jenny, I was making a note. That's why I called on you. Go ahead, you go first.
Yeah, this is tricky because, so you're going to hear John and I fumble a little bit, because you have at the heart of the issue is students' identity and agency. So if you don't pick up their strategy and take it on, then it could interfere with the respecting of their thinking. So, but you don't always need every strategy. I know I struggle with this when I'm giving like a number talk, for example, to really zoom in on some strategies. So I like to get like 2 or 3 to say, hey, we have some ideas here. Let's just stop here for this problem and let's move on. Maybe we'll see a different strategy on the next problem. I also, when I really want to bring attention to, say, compensation, I want to draw attention to that and really focus on some of the efficiency instead of just going on to the next problem and brainstorming some solutions. So I think there's a delicate balance there in honoring people's thinking, but also bringing attention to a strategy that's particularly useful.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I was taking down the last part there. And the question was about problem solving. I think it really applies to fluency as well. And having that discussion with students, not necessarily, I mean, we do go towards the right answer and getting that right answer, but really talking about like the process and what makes sense. Why did you choose that approach? How is your approach different or the same as others? Why does your solution make sense, or why did your approach make sense? And it's not so much that the answer was wrong, but the strategy selected or applied didn't work out, and having that conversation about why it didn't, because it's not about correcting their answers, but guiding their thinking so that they can stand on their own without my conversation with them, so to speak. So thanks for that, whoever that sent that in. Jeff, any other questions for us? And Jenny, I'll take the next one, I promise, unless it's hard.
Sure, I have another question.
Uh-oh, here we go, Jenny.
How can we support students with processing delays in their abilities?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Jenny, I'll start here, and then I know you have many things to add there. I think that what's important is giving students the right amount of time, and that's different for every student. I think one of the challenges that we face is that we say that everybody on the 37th day should have the same strategy or the same, approach in place or what have you. And so one of the things we talk about is like how to get extra doses of practice for repetition. How do we revisit for acquisition purposes? Because it might be not necessarily that the student, hasn't had enough practice. They just didn't fully understand the approach the first time. So I think it's about adjusting time and putting other scaffolds in place. Jenny, what would you add to that?
I feel like the most research-based strategies for students with special needs and students that struggle is making is explicit strategy instruction. So extensive use of visuals and context, which came up earlier, to help them see strategies, because these strategies are oftentimes more intuitive, so that plays to the strengths of students. As long as it's not one more series of things to remember. That's why we point out that strategies and algorithms are different. Strategies are about reasoning. Algorithms are a series of steps to remember. So just playing to those, the CSA model, and really being explicit. Oh, did you see like on that with those stacks where it was showing how Y 10 times a number turns out to be, or 9 times a number turns out to be 10 times a number minus a group, because you can explicitly see it, and then you have to carry it through.
Yeah, Jenny, I'm glad you came at it from that angle as well, because thinking about, all sorts of learners with special needs or without, right? We might have difficulties with the first acquisition of a strategy, and so you need to be explicit, just like you talked about there, right? And my early part was maybe it's a matter of needing opportunity to practice to get it down, so to speak, or to play with it. So I'm really glad you brought that piece in. Jeff, anything else for us?
Sure, we have time for one more question. There's a lot of talk about, parents as students too, and they don't understand the flexibility and they get excited when they begin to catch on. But how can we figure out ways for them to access additional strategies that they've never seen before?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We dedicated an entire chapter to how do we engage families. Parent math nights, we talked about fluency math nights specifically, and I'll let Jenny add on to some of these things, but parents actually do get strategies. They use them all the time. We just have to do, not just have to, we have a lot of things we have to do, but one of them is communicating the importance of these and helping parents understand how to use them as well. And I know that Hillary Kreisberg writes about parent engagement and what have you. So that is a nice way to maybe blend the two ideas, but I'll let Jenny add to some other notes and highlight some other things from that chapter.
Yeah, I think you've covered it. I'll just add one thing, and that is that we want to position parents as the same advocates we are for their child. So like John said, you put up a couple of problems, easier than the ones that we pose to you all, but just ones to reason about. How did you solve that? How did you come to learn how to solve problems that way? They didn't learn it in school. Wouldn't it be nice to have this as your school mathematics, to think about a good way to solve a problem instead of this is the only way to solve a problem? That's what we're trying to do. So I'm just really trying to help parents see the usefulness of a fluency approach. And yeah, a whole math night that is a fluency night, somebody commented on in the chat, just to kind of address these fallacies and dig into the ones that are the most important for families to attend to.
Terrific. I think that brings us to the end of our questions. Now would be a good time to turn it over to Margaret O'Connor.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Jenny and John, for that conversation on figuring out math fluency and going through those 12 fallacies. Just a few reminders. This webinar was recorded and your certificate of attendance will be sent via email in the next few days. Please visit corwin.com/webinars to register for any upcoming webinars. And now, time to announce our 3 lucky random winners of a copy of Jenny and John's hot off the press book, Figuring Out Fluency in Mathematics Teaching and Learning. And they are Todd Small Canyon, Anne Elise Record, and Pam Harris. And we will be in touch via email to get those books out to you. And then for anyone else who, sorry if you weren't one of those lucky winners, the good news is that you can get a 20% discount and free shipping on corwin.com using the promo code webinars, and that is in all caps. A big thank you to everyone who attended tonight and taken time out of your day to join us. And a big thank you to Jenny and John.
So thank you as always for having us. Thank you, Aaron, for being a wonderful partner in Corwin, and Jenny, always love working with you.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks everyone for joining us. I popped in the chat a few times a link to the PDF of the fallacies and the truths. I'll pop it in one more time. It's just flying by with all the thanks, but we're really grateful for the kind reaction and the very active chat tonight. So thank you. Have a good evening.
Hope your bracket's not destroyed. Be well. Stay safe.